So it's a great pleasure to have with us today two people who have done a great deal, both as translators and as publishers, to introduce contemporary French poetry to an American audience. Keith and Rosemarie Waldrop are poets, translators, and the co-editors of Burning Deck Press, which they founded in 1961. Rosemarie Waldrop is the author or co-author of numerous books of poetry, as well as books of criticism and 2 novels. Recent works include Love, Light Pronouns, published in 2003, Blind Sight in 2004, and Splitting Images in 2006. She has been made a Chevalier des Arts et des Lettres by the French government and was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2006. Rosemarie Waldrop translates from both French and German. In the field of French poetry, she has translated most of the work of Edmond Jabez, receiving a Columbia University Translation Center Award for this work. She has also translated volumes by Emmanuel Ocar and Jacques Roubaud. Most recently, in collaboration with Keith Waldrop, Jacques Roubaud's The Form of a City Changes Faster, Alas, than the Human Heart, published by Dalkey Archive Press in 2006. Keith Waldrop is the author of numerous books of poetry and prose and has translated the work of Claude Royer-Journoux, Anne-Marie Albiac, and Edmond Jabez, among others. Recent books of poetry include The House Seen from Nowhere in 2003 and The Real Subject in 2005. He has recently published a translation of Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil, in 2006. He teaches at Brown University, and the French government has named him Chevalier des Arts et des Lettres. Keith and Rosemarie Waldrop will be reading today from their translations of French poetry with a focus on contemporary poets. Edmond Jabez, in a poem in the Book of Shares, asks the following question. This is in Rosemarie Waldrop's translation. Is it possible that written language is both outside and inside language, that it splits off from the common tongue and language apart, which it carries beyond language to a point where it is alone, facing the infinite, yet remaining still at the heart of that language whose possibilities it has exhausted? End of quotation. Although Jabez is talking about writing and language in general, I think we hear echoes here of Walter Benjamin's The Task of the Translator. The poetry we will hear today poses a range of difficulties for translators. Each poet explores the limits of poetry in his or her own way, from the poetic Kabbalism of Edmond Jabez to the mathematical and Olympian constraints of Jacques Roubaud, or to Anne-Marie Albiac's investigation of the space of the printed page. Yet these poets also have a great deal in common, all of them experimenting with and reflecting on the possibilities of poetry. They are poets of formal rigour and critical reflexivity. Theirs is a poetry of philosophical and sometimes mystical contemplation, but also a poetry preoccupied with the concreteness of the written word. Jean-Michel Moulpois has characterised many of them as poets of littéralité, literalness, that is, of strict adherence to the letter. Keith and Rosemarie Waldrop's translations managed to achieve both fidelity to this littéralité, literalness, and adaptation of these poems to a new audience and literary context. Their work offers an ideal opportunity for reflection on both the state of contemporary poetry and the goals of translation, and I hope we'll have an enlightening discussion about both in the question and answer session that will follow this reading. Finally, I'd like to thank Mireille Dobrinsky for reading the original French text, helping to make this into a bilingual event. And I'd also like to announce that Keith and Rosemarie Waldrop will be giving another reading tomorrow afternoon at the Harold Washington Library downtown at 3 o'clock. So please welcome Keith and Rosemarie Waldrop.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. This is going to be a bit of a sampler, like actually a number of poets and just a little bit of each one, and I hope it will be sort of like appetizers to give you an appetite to read more of them. And I thought I would like to start with a few poems from A Test of Solitude by Emmanuel Ocar. He's the youngest of the group I'm going to read. And this is actually a book of sonnets, but they don't look like what you expect sonnets to look like. In other words, he interpreted the sonnet simply as 14 lines, no other constraints. And some of them actually are prose blocks that happen to be 14 lines long. And sometimes when he makes what we would normally call a stanza break, he counts that stanza break as one line. It happens to be a blank line, but it's still a line in his counting to 14. The book is all really of a piece, and it's all addressed to a woman named Viviane, who was his baker, who sold him his bread and his rolls every day. The other things that go on in this poem are he lived on a farm-like place that was owned by a friend of his, and there are all sorts of references to burning a stump of an old tree and to digging a little trench between two ponds that they gave the fancy-sounding Italian pronunciation of canale, le canale, he says when he reads in French. But I have sort of, in the couple poems that I'm going to read, I've sort of picked out a different strand, which is the strand really of grammatical considerations that run all through the sequence. And I thought with doing just a few, it might be good to sort of stress one thread rather than trying to touch on everything that goes on. So, October, return of the robins. What's in front of my eyes? Viviane is Viviane, alone, evident. To tell you that I've seen her, how I've seen her, having only this name to go on, to show you that my eyes have seen her. That is to say, I construct a solitude. It's you I am thinking of. Unique smile. I'm telling you of my smile, her mouth.
Octobre, le retour des rouges-gorges, ce que j'ai sous les yeux. Viviane est Viviane, seule, évidente. Vous dire que je l'ai vue. Comme je l'ai vue, n'ayant que ce nom à ma disposition. Vous montrer que mon regard, je l'ai vu ainsi. Viviane est Viviane. C'est-à-dire, je construis une solitude. C'est à vous que je pense. Sourire unique. Je vous parle de mon sourire, sa bouche.
If I posit as a rule that every utterance is a tautology, it follows that every proposition, spoken or written, says what it says and says nothing else. A rhinoceros crosses the room. A tautology is autoliteral. Nothing explains it. It explains nothing. It is sufficient unto itself. Nothing leads up to it. Nothing follows it. It is itself, alone, evident, like our lives. It cannot be a sentence, even if it resembles one, because a sentence never exists by itself. Sentences connect with one another.
Si je pose en règle que tout énoncé est une tautologie, il s'ensuit que toute proposition, parlée ou écrite, dit ce qu'elle dit et ne dit pas autre chose. Un rhinocéros traverse la pièce. Une tautologie est autolittérale. Rien ne l'explique, elle n'explique rien. Elle se suffit. Rien ne la mène, rien ne la suit. Elle est elle-même seule, évidente, comme notre vie. Elle ne peut pas être une phrase, mais elle y ressemble, parce qu'une phrase n'existe jamais seule. Les phrases s'enchaînent les unes aux autres.
Or else how Viviane is Viviane escapes grammar, or the test of a completely different grammar. One could say a test of solitude. In the sense of Gertrude Stein writing, I am a grammarian. V is V. What other mode of time gets in there? The time to go from the canale to the burnt stump. one beat of a butterfly wing, the form of a fold, suspense, Saturday morning in Bordeaux. This afternoon, I'll go to Farg to get bread.
Ou comment Viviane et Viviane échappent à la grammaire, ou bien le test d'une toute autre grammaire. On pourrait dire un test de solitude, au sens où Gertrude Stein écrit « Je suis une grammairienne ». V et V. Quel autre mode de temps se met ici en place? Le temps de passer du canale à la souche brûlée, un battement d'ailes de papillon, la forme d'un pli. Suspense. Samedi matin à Bordeaux. Cet après-midi, je vais à Farg chercher du pain.
What empties a name of its substance? What kind of grammar would a grammar without questions be? And what are the questions about? You are not a question, but surrounded by kinds of questions. Is it snowing? How do wolves howl? Yes, Viviane. Not answering any question. Could one say that yes and to be are one? Now yes. I felt I understood. Yes could be the missing word.
Qu'est-ce qui vide un nom de sa substance? Quelle sorte de grammaire serait une grammaire sans question? Et sur quoi portent les questions? Vous n'êtes pas une question, mais entouré de sortes de questions. Est-ce qu'il neige comme hurlent les loups? Oui, Viviane. Ne répondant à aucune question, pourrait-on dire que oui et être sont un? Maintenant, oui. J'avais l'impression de comprendre. Oui, pourrait être le mot manquant.
I am telling you of this silence. Finger on the index, the rings, the cut. This black mark in the space delineates the architecture of the landscape. On these 2 mild winter mornings, the fish, red shading into green, put in timid appearances. And Pierre says that the penguins' territory is their song, 2 by 2, to find each other amid the crowd. A period of silence, a long period where division begins. I am telling you of my silence and of the pain of objects. I tell of this solitude.
Je vous parle de ce silence, le doigt sur l'index, les bagues, la coupure. Ce signe noir dans l'espace dessine l'architecture du paysage. Par ces matinées d'hiver trop douces, les poissons rouges tirant sur vert font de timides apparitions. Et Pierre dit que le territoire des pingouins est leur champ, 2 par 2, pour se retrouver au milieu de la multitude. Une période de silence. Un long période où la division commence. Je vous parle de mon silence et de la douleur des objets. Je parle de cette solitude.
And now we'll go to something that has a very different tone, to Jacques Roubaud's book Quelque chose noir, something black. Quelque chose noir, the title is slightly ungrammatical in French. The partitive is lacking. The French would normally say, for something black, they would say quelque chose de noir. And so I think he took this slightly ungrammatical form from his wife's French, which was Canadian French. And the book, and so that's why I separated something into a couple of words, just to get a little sense of something a little strange. This whole book is an elegy for his wife, Alix Cléo Roubaud, who was a Canadian photographer and died at the age of 31. And this whole book is an elegy for her. And actually the title is also the title of a sequence of her photographs. And this book, which was published by Dalkey Archive, actually has one of the photographs on the cover and several others inside. They're very remarkable photos. The book contains 9 sections. Each section contains 9 poems. Each poem has either 9 lines or 9 paragraphs. And as a translator, I was very lucky that he stopped there, because before that he had done a sequence called 31 au cube, 31 cubed, where then also every line had 31 syllables. Luckily, these paragraphs or lines have more than 9 syllables, which made it a lot easier on the translator. Yeah. I think this is really all you need to. We're going to read just 3 poems from the 6 sections, which refers strongly to one of the photographs of Alix. So, this photograph, your last. This photograph, your last, I've left on the wall where you put it, between the 2 windows. And in the evening, catching the light, I sit down on this chair, the same still, and look at it, where you put it, between the 2 windows. And what one sees here, catching the light as it fades in the bay of roof to the left of the church, what one sees, evenings, sitting on this chair, is precisely what the picture shows on the wall, on the dark brown wallpaper, between the 2 windows, light, flowing in 2 oblique tongues, converging in the photograph on the precise point where the conceiving eyes, yours, conceived of light pouring forever toward the person, me, who'd look at it, placed at the heart of what it shows. Because at the heart of what it shows, of what I see, there's also, in addition, the picture itself, contained in it. And the light comes in, as always, from the bay of roofs to the left of the church. But above all, there is what's missing now, you. For in the picture, your eyes, which look at me here, on this chair where I'm sitting in order to see you, your eyes, already see the moment when you'll be absent, foresee it. And that's why I have been unable to budge from this place.
Cette photographie, ta dernière. Cette photographie, ta dernière, je l'ai laissée sur le mur où tu l'avais mise entre les 2 fenêtres. Et le soir, recevant la lumière, je m'assieds sur cette chaise, toujours la même, la regarder où tu l'as posée entre les 2 fenêtres. Et ce que l'on voit là, recevant la lumière qui décline, dans le golfe de toit à gauche de l'église, ce qu'on voit les soirs, assis sur cette chaise, est, précisément, ce que montre l'image laissée sur le mur, sur le papier brun sombre du mur, entre les 2 fenêtres, la lumière avance, en 2 langues obliques, coule dans l'image, vers le point exact où le regard qu'il a conçu, le tien, a conçu de verser indéfiniment de la lumière vers qui, moi, la regarde, posée au cœur de ce qu'elle montre. Parce qu'en ce cœur, le cœur de ce qu'elle montre, que je vois, il y a aussi, encore, l'image elle-même, contenue en lui. Et la lumière entre, depuis toujours, depuis le golfe de toit à gauche de l'église, mais surtout, il y a ce qui manque, ce qui maintenant manque, toi. Parce que tes yeux dans l'image qui me regarde, en ce point, cette chaise où je me place pour te voir, tes yeux, voient déjà le moment où tu serais absente, le prévoient, et c'est pourquoi je n'ai pas pu bouger de ce lieu-là.
Next one is called Riddle and is after Abraham de Vermeil. So Riddle. Without being now, without weight, without words, without place, without living kin hanging on my eyes, without rusty acid, without the sea's curve, without line or color, which touches, stirs, blurs. The clouds hid me, daylight draws me out. My mother made me straight, my father turned me around. The sun tied me to its bright black door. With its probe of glass, night turned me to air. The void has now cut me off from the hand that shaped out of the faces known a closeness holding many worlds. Which ink was it? Guess if you can. That grey brought me up, black swallowed me down, that trapped me in those eyes and dealt me to the dark.
Énigme, d'après Abraham de Vermeil. Sans être maintenant, sans lieu, sans poids, sans dire, sans parenté vivante accrochée au regard, sans acide rouillé, sans courbe de la mer, sans ligne ou sans couleur qui touche ou trouble ou vibre. Les nuages me cachaient et le jour me retire. Ma mère me fit droite et mon père à l'envers. Le soleil me lia de portes claires et noires. La nuit m'évapora de sa sonde de vitre. Le néant maintenant m'a coupé de la main qui me constituait de visage germain. Une proximité pleine de plusieurs mondes. Devine, si tu peux, quelle encre était cela, qui grise me vomit et noir m'avala, qui me prit dans ses yeux, me conférant à l'ombre.
And the last one goes back to that photograph. This photograph, your last. This photograph, your last, I've left on the wall, between the two windows, above the unused TV set, and evenings when, in the bay of roofs to the left of the church, the light grows dense, and also at the same time flows in two oblique, unchanging estuaries in the picture. I sit down on this chair, from which one can see both the picture inside, the photo, and around it, what it shows, which only in the evening, through the slant of the light, coincides with it, except that in the picture on the left, you're looking out toward where I'm sitting in order to see you, invisible now, in the light of evening, heavy on the bay of roofs between the two windows and on me, not in your side, which in the picture fixes the thought of the photo devoted to this, these evenings now without you, to this wavering point of all-out doubt.
Cette photographie, ta dernière. Cette photographie, ta dernière, je l'ai laissée sur le mur, entre les deux fenêtres, au-dessus de la télévision désaffectée, et le soir, dans le golfe de toit à gauche de l'église, quand la lumière se concentre, qui en même temps s'écoule en deux estuaires obliques et inchangeables, dans l'image, je m'assieds sur cette chaise d'où l'on voit à la fois l'image intérieure de la photographie et autour d'elle ce qu'elle montre, qui seulement, le soir, coïncide par la direction de la lumière avec elle, sinon en cela qu'à gauche, dans l'image, tu regardes vers le point où je m'assieds, te voir, invisible maintenant, dans la lumière du soir, qui pèse sur le golfe de toit entre les deux fenêtres et moi. Absent de ton regard, qui dans l'image fixe la pensée de cette image dédiée à cela, les soirs de maintenant, sans toi, au point vacillant du doute de tout.
And the third sample that I would like to read is from Edmond Jabès, the Book of Shares, which actually was published right here at the University of Chicago Press. I mean, the English, the translation was, of course. I don't know if you know Edmond Jabès's work. His best-known title is the Book of Questions. And he works very much with aphorisms and long pauses. But I've actually, for this, I've chosen, the book in French is called Le Livre de Partage, but I couldn't bring myself to call it the Book of Sharing, because sharing has become such a new age thing and a really sentimental thing by now in this. So I called it the Book of Shares, but they're definitely not financial shares. So I've chosen a little section that has, in most of his books there are aphorisms, and then there are little poems, and then there are little conversations, and then there are excerpts from a diary. So it varies between all these forms. And the one I've chosen starts out with some aphorisms, but then goes into a meditation on Adam and Eve. Which I'm very fond of. And the chapter is called Adam or the Birth of Anxiety. So, and I'm only going to read a couple of these aphorisms and then go into the more coherent meditation, and then Mireille will read the French. So, Adam or the Birth of Anxiety. Imagine a day without a day behind it, a night without a previous night. Imagine nothing and something in the middle of nothing. What if you were told this tiny something was you? And God created Adam. He created him a man, depriving him of memory. Man without childhood, without past, without tears, without laughter or smiles. Man come out of nothing, unable even to claim a portion of this nothing. Did God consider for a moment that with one stroke he deprived this man of what he would in the future grant all other creatures? Adam, son of nothing by the will of God, fruit of wanton benevolence. Fruit ripe before ripening, tree in full leaf before growing. World completed before emerging from nothing, but only in the mind of God. The past reassures us. Man without such security, delivered to whom, to what? Oh, emptiness. Nothing to lean against, nothing to rest on. Is this anxiety? Orphaned in the fullest sense of the term of father and mother, but also of himself. Are we not engendered in that moment of carnal and spiritual experience? What could seeing and hearing be for him? What could speaking or acting mean? What weight had a word? What reverberations in the future? What could it profit him? What contentment, what soothing could he expect from any gesture? Discoveries, encounters, surprises, disappointments, wonder? Probably. But in relation to what other approaches? In reply to which inner questions, lacking all comparison? The key lies in the fertilized egg, the ovule, the fetus, the mystery and the miracle. Eve came out of Adam's sleep, woke next to him by the will of God. She too, a woman without having been a child, not having seen her body grow and develop, felt her mind open out, giving full rein to voluptuous sexual desires or fighting them. They looked at each other without a word. What could they say? They could only observe, only study their difference. Days of boredom followed, of uneasiness, of anxiety too. They were God's playthings, living together, yet unable to get anything from each other, living, yet without landmarks of existence, not even a picture, a portrait which would bear out that they were real. Only an unfamiliar body and a mind unable to think. Enter the serpent. Enter into their ears the blandishing voice of the reptile, which was perhaps only the urgent voice of their anxiety. Ah, this need to know, which on their part was not just curiosity, but the hope to be healed. For God had implanted suffering in them, the hurt of being. God had made a mistake. God had done wrong. What if Eve's sin were really the sin of God, which Eve, for love of him, took on herself? Both a sin of love and the mad wish to save herself and Adam. Anxiety had encouraged the act, hastened the coming of their freedom. Breaking God's commandment meant for one and the other finding their humanity. But two questions remain. Did God know when he created man that he could never make a man of him because he could only become one by himself? And did Eve's weakness later seem a lesson to God and to Adam, an essential test leading to their particular consciousness of existence, to the acceptance of life and death?
Adam ou la naissance de l'angoisse. Imagine un jour sans arrière-jour, une nuit sans arrière-nuit. Imagine le rien et quelque chose au milieu du rien. Et si l'on te disait que cette toute petite chose était toi? Et Dieu créa Adam. Il le créa homme, le privant de mémoire. Homme sans enfance, sans passé, sans larmes, sans rire, ni sourire. Homme surgit du rien, ne pouvant même pas revendiquer une part de ce rien. Dieu a-t-il un instant songé qu'il privait d'un seul coup cet homme de tout ce qu'il consentira dans le futur aux autres créatures? Adam, fils du rien, par la volonté de Dieu, fruit de ce bon vouloir gratuit. Fruit mûr avant de mûrir, arbre feuillu avant de croître, univers achevé avant d'émerger du néant, mais dans la pensée de Dieu seulement. Le passé nous rassure. Homme sans assurance, livré à qui, à quoi? Ô vide, s'adosser à rien, ne pouvoir se reposer sur rien, est-ce cela l'angoisse? Orphelin dans toute l'acceptation du terme, de père et de mère, mais aussi de soi-même, ne sommes-nous pas engendrés par l'instant vécu charnellement et spirituellement? Que pourrait être pour lui le regard, l'écoute? Que signifierait pour lui parler, agir? Quel poids pourrait avoir une parole? Quelle répercussion dans l'avenir? Quel profit pourrait-il tirer? Quel contentement, quel apaisement pourrait-il espérer d'un geste quelconque? Découverte, rencontre, étonnement, déception ou émerveillement? Probablement. Mais par rapport à quelles autres approches? En réponse à quelle intime interrogation? La comparaison faisant défaut. La clé est dans l'œuf fécondé, dans l'ovule, dans le fœtus. Le mystère et le miracle. Ève sortit du sommeil d'Adam, s'éveilla auprès de lui, selon le vœu de Dieu. Femme, elle aussi, avant d'avoir été enfant, n'ayant pas vu son corps grandir, se former, n'ayant pas assisté à l'épanouissement de son esprit, cédé aux voluptueuses envies du sexe ou lutter contre. Ils se regardèrent sans proférer une parole. Que pouvaient-ils se dire? Ils ne pouvaient que s'observer, qu'étudier leurs différences. Des jours d'ennui, de malaise se succédèrent, d'anxiété aussi. Ils étaient de Dieu le jouet. Vivre ensemble et ne pouvoir rien obtenir l'un de l'autre. Vivre et n'avoir aucun repère d'existence, fût-ce une image, un portrait de soi qui attesterait leur réalité. Seul un corps inconnu et une intelligence incapable de penser. Ici entre en jeu le serpent. Ici parvient jusqu'à leurs oreilles la voix enjôleuse du reptile qui ne serait, peut-être, que la voix pressante de leur angoisse. Ah, ce besoin de savoir qui ne serait point de leur part curiosité, mais espoir de guérison. Car Dieu a introduit en eux la souffrance, le mal d'être. Dieu s'est trompé. Dieu a fauté. Et si le péché d'Ève était vraiment celui de Dieu, que celle-ci, par amour pour lui, prit à son compte, à la fois péché d'amour et folle désir de se sauver et de sauver Adam. L'angoisse avait favorisé l'acte, hâté l'événement de leur liberté. Enfreindre le commandement de Dieu, c'est, pour l'un et l'autre, retrouver leur humanité. Mais deux questions subsistent. Dieu, en créant l'homme, savait-il qu'il n'arriverait jamais à en faire un homme, puisque seul à celui-ci il appartient de le devenir par soi-même? La faiblesse d'Ève apparut-elle plus tard à Dieu comme une leçon et à Adam comme l'existentielle épreuve débouchant sur une certaine conscience d'exister, sur l'acceptation de la vie et de la mort?
Thank you.
I'm going to start with a poem, two poems actually, a poem by Claude Voyer-Journoux, who has been associated often with Emmanuel Ocar, for instance. He is sometimes considered as a sort of chef d'école of certain recent poets. One of the differences in translating a lot of recent French poems is that while lines and stanzas and paragraphs and so forth are often the basic units of poetry, with many poets now, the essential unit is the page, so that often it makes a great difference to them whether a line goes on to the next page or not, or whether a paragraph goes on to it or whatever. And if this means also that they are fanatically interested in where the words go on a particular page. And in translating several recent French poets, of course these are living poets, and I show them the text, and many of them know English, or at least some English. Claude Voyer-Journoux knows English very well, and I say, have I made mistakes and so forth? And the manuscript will come back with all sorts of mistakes, like this line should have been a centimeter to the left, which is often very puzzling because the English words are not the same length as the French words, and so you can't make it exactly like it. And often I've sort of insisted with publishers, if they're doing some of these works, I send them the French and I say that's what it's supposed to look like. here are the words that I want to go in, but this is what it has to look like. And if the poets go into a rage, they can attack the printer. The most recent, Claude Voyager-Nous mainly is known for a tetralogy, all of which I've translated, though the fourth volume has only been printed in magazines. Since then, I was afraid it took him many years to write this tetralogy, and he was always talking about it as though that was to be his work, and I was terribly afraid that when he finished it, he would never write it anymore. But that turns out to be happily a false assumption, and since then he has published one more book called A Theory of Prepositions. However, it has not yet been published in French. It has been published in a Spanish translation and in my English translation, and in magazines. Now, the text has been published, but not as a book in France, I think. I haven't seen it anyway. But since then, he has written some more to go in it. I think that's why he hasn't published it in French. I think he wants it to be a book which includes something more than is in the book so far. And so he added the additional poems he published in a magazine called Fin, which I guess to live up to its name has just quit publication. And here is a poem called Every Pain is a Local Effort. It's in 3 pages, and I'll read the English first. Every pain is a local effort. Oh, I should say also that I'm reading this in what Claude would consider very approximate reading, because he puts a stopwatch on the desk, and there's an exact number of seconds between stanzas, and if there's more space between, then there are more seconds, and so forth. I find this, I don't have a stopwatch, so it's not absolutely the same. Every pain is a local effort. The eye is practicing. A fall does not injure coastal regions. The tree hems in this small, motionless body by sleep, by dividing. Await the greater for the distance she takes. With day, it begins in the days of moving with a full load. The other has to stand aside. The corporeal part takes the lead, masking the entrance to an arcade. Articulation discloses a scene. Visible outpour, swelling of a skin, of a connection. The preposition chooses incest. No longer recognizing this lateral view, grammar of perturbation. In the angles, the spurts. It becomes adapted, facilitating the outline. The accumulation of words defines suspense, exactness of shadows. At the edge of the stroke, a transaction inverts the perspectives. On stage, stretched out mute bodies form an alphabet. Rumor incites surrender. Bound to its loss, a paradoxical geography, an unstopped slide, she also sees the doll at its angle, dark slant of a back.
Toute douleur est un effort local. L'œil s'exerce. Une chute n'entame pas les régions côtières. L'arme enferme ce petit corps immobile. Par sommeil et division. Un poids d'autant plus grand qu'elle s'éloigne. De jour, ça commence dans la stupeur d'un déplacement à pleine charge. L'autre est tenu de s'écarter. La partie corporelle prend le dessus et masque l'ouverture d'une arcade. L'articulation découvre une scène. C'est l'épanchement visible, le soulèvement d'une peau, d'un rapport. La préposition choisit l'inceste. Ne plus reconnaître cette vue latérale. Grammaire de la perturbation. Dans les angles, les saillies. Elle s'approprie ce qui facilite le tracé. L'accumulation des vocables définit le suspense. L'exactitude des ombres. Au bord du trait, une transaction inverse les perspectives. Sur scène, des corps allongés et muets forment un alphabet. La rumeur incite à l'abandon. Liée à sa perte, une géographie paradoxale, un glissement que rien n'arrête, elle aussi voit la poupée dans son angle. Dos incliné, noir.
The next poet I'll read from is Anne-Marie Albiach, from her third full book. She has 3 books with a number of shorter texts in between, which are collected in these books. Years ago, I translated her first book, État, which took me about 12 years. Not working at it constantly, you understand, but still. And so I somehow didn't want to get involved in the second book, and didn't. But then the third book came along, and I fell for it. And actually, I was asked if I would translate this third book, and I looked at the table of contents that was given, and I had already translated 5 out of the 6 poems that were in it. And I thought, well, that's fine. It turned out that the 6th poem is longer than all the others put together. Anne-Marie Albiach and Claude Voyer-Journoux were very much associated in the early part of their career, and still are. One of the things I did not mention about Claude Voyer-Journoux is that he has a strange process of writing in notebooks or somewhere. I don't know where he writes these things, but he writes prose of apparently all the time, or a lot of the time. One assumes for years that he's not writing, but apparently he's writing all the time in these notebooks. And then, in order to write a poem, he takes passages or phrases or sentences or whatever from this prose and puts them at certain places on the page, and that's how he makes his pages. Now, Anne-Marie Albiach also does this. I don't know which of them influenced the other more. They were very much influencing each other in their early days, I'm sure. But she carried it, I believe, somewhat farther than he. And that is that she would also have these large blocks of prose, and she would pick certain words or phrases, but leave them exactly where they are on the page, and as it were, erase all the other words. And in fact, in her early readings, she would, in order to read a text in which there would be maybe 8 or 10 words on a page in various places, she would read a word and then she would be silent for the amount that it would have taken her to read the text in between, if it were there, which it is not. This also, needless to say, made it excruciating to translate, because the words were often simple, and even with my French, I knew what the words meant usually, but since there was often almost no context to them, I didn't know what exactly they meant. And I can't say that she was very helpful in most of this. When I would say, what did you mean by X? She would give that wonderful French moo and say, I meant, and she would say the same word. This was not helpful at all. She was very helpful in giving me the antecedents of pronouns and such, so that I found out from her whether il meant it or he, for instance, things like that, which there's no way I could have told otherwise. And she always told me immediately in such a way that sounded like, of course, it means that. So anyway, she is one of these page poets, and actually for this I didn't think of this to start with, but why don't we read it page by page rather than as a whole. It's in the book which I call Figured Image, which has been published by Post Apollo Press, and in it is a poem called Figures of Memory.
Les figurations de mémoire.
And you can see from this that, it's more on a page than some of her pages, but there was a famous review of Claude Voyer-Journoux's first book, in which the reviewer just started out, "Que de blanc, so much white." Okay, figures of memory. The term specifies the movement, flagrant, parallel begetting of a form. The internal figures dissolve. Gestures of destruction unstable. At first stroke stifled. Previous words. At that moment, and she turns away, he stands still. She had seen them daily in the reiteration of anonymity.
Le terme précise le mouvement, en délit, l'engendrement parallèle d'une forme. Les figures internes dissolvent. Instables les gestes de destruction. Étouffement du premier trait. Les paroles antérieures. À cet instant. Et elle se détourne. Il est immobile. Elle les avait vus quotidiennement, dans la réitération de l'anonymat.
Laws. Obedient to the pressure within, struck dumb by scandal. They spring up. Where their sight grew dim. She dared not infringe that aversion. Confined at the boundary. Outside implied a prohibition.
Laws, les lois. Soumise à la pression interne, cette mutité du scandale. Ils surgissent. Où la vue se faisait trouble. Elle n'osait enfreindre cette répulsion-là. Dans la réclusion, à la limite. L'extérieur impliquait un interdit.
The notch scans the same alliteration. Would they thereafter have enumerated the ensemble? She talks of coming seasons, ousting alterity. The reply in trembling a punctuation. Violence, no end, or the play of outmoded numbers. By sheer force of memory.
L'incision, scande, la même allitération. Aurait-il dès lors énuméré l'ensemble? Elle parle de saison prochaine, évinçant l'altérité. La réponse dans la crainte, une ponctuation. La violence ne cesse, ou le jeu des nombres anciens. À la force de la mémoire.
And this time he went away. In his limbs, gravity. Hurt breast. From the liquid element the myth sprang up, mouth open beyond the bruises. Subjected to this elucidation, their word, alternative,
Et cette fois, il s'absentait dans la pesanteur des membres. Poitrine blessée. De l'élément liquide surgissait le mythe, bouche ouverte au-delà des meurtrissures. Assujetti à cette élucidation. Leurs paroles alternatives.
sleep where the censor menaces, ablution, this chill in the corridors, rough draft, archaic failure of eloquence, hand reaching for forbidden fruit, signs, on the bias tongues laminated nightly, such theatricality of indictment.
Sommeil, où la censure menace. Ablution. Ce froid des corridors. L'esquisse. Archaïque. L'élocution fait défaut. Main devant les nourritures interdites. Les signes, dans le versant langue laminée la nuit, cette théâtralité du réquisitoire.
Dorsal exacerbation of day's double gash. A geometry.
Exacerbation dorsale de la double entaille du jour. Une géométrie.
One of the excuses I have for translating is that there are all sorts of poems that I can't write, and I find if I find a poet whose work I really like, but something I just completely foreign to me, I think that there's somebody I should translate, because it means that I can, even though I can't do it, I can do it. And in fact, people think I'm joking when I say this, but I started translating French poetry because I could read it. That is, in a sense, I could read the words, but it doesn't seem poetry yet. And my French was good enough to figure out the words with a dictionary at least, but it didn't become poetry. And by translating it, I could make it into poetry. This is not true anymore. I can read French poetry now and it's poetry, but that's the way it started, and seemed reasonable at the time. In translating both Claude Voyer-Journoud and Anne-Marie Albiac, who are in some ways go in the same direction, though they're rather different. Once you start reading more of them, they seem more dissimilar than they do when you start. One of the problems is, for me, that I cannot use most of something that's very natural to me, and that is to find something that really sounds right to me. They're very suspicious of any sound effects. They don't want anything. They don't want any alliteration, which in English you can't avoid, but you can tone it down as much as possible. I think of poetry as really sound, and it isn't that they don't want it to sound right, but if it sounds at all luscious or anything that strikes them as flowery, it's just gone. And so one of the things I have to do is keep toning things down, which doesn't come all that naturally to me. And I have translated other poets in which I go the opposite direction. Jean Grosjean, for instance, I've translated, and the most, in a way, un-American sound effects and long sentences and contorted sentences, and a vocabulary that is somewhat beyond my own, I must admit, seems to be what I can use there. This is one excuse for my having published a translation of Les Fleurs du Mal. I've translated some surrealist poets, which I have to be very careful among my French poet friends not to mention. That's the real taboo in poets who are now in their 40s, 50s, 60s. One French poet we know was reported to have said to one of us, in fact, surrealist poets should be throttled by the age of 4. But Baudelaire is a little earlier than that, and my problem with Baudelaire translations was that I didn't like them. And I realized there are all sorts of things you should do if you're translating Baudelaire. You should have a very luscious vocabulary, but you should also have wonderful metrical effects and beautiful rhymes. And well, there are several things that it's ordinarily claimed that you should take into account in translation: the original language and the language you're translating into and the differences between them. Translation of the Iliad by Chapman in Elizabethan time and a translation of the Iliad by Pope 100 years later sound completely different, because the time you're translating should be taken into account, and that's usually recognized. But what isn't recognized is you have to take into account the translator, in a sense of what can the translator do with this. And I can write iambic pentameter, and I love rhymes, but in translating some of Baudelaire, I found that I couldn't get the tone that way, whereas if I used a kind of half versified prose, it sort of came through. I'll just read one of these poems to show you what I have in mind. This is the opening poem of the book, called To the Reader. And what I have done is made a verset out of each stanza of Baudelaire. So it's prose, but it's prose in the way that the King James translators did the Book of Psalms. That is, it's poetry, but it's in prose that is limited by a rhythmic sense. And this is To the Reader. Stupidity, error, sin, cupidity, they squat in our minds and torment our bodies while we nourish our comforting remorse, the way beggars feed their lice. Our sins are headstrong, our repentance faint-hearted. We make our confession firm and full and saunter back into the mire, confident in cheap tears to rinse us clean. On the pillow of perdition, Satan Trismegistus lulls the mind, spellbinds it, and the fine metal of our will is quite vaporized by this clever chemist. It's the devil holds the strings that move us. We find a lure in loathsome objects, each day another step toward hell, unhorrified, downward through stinking shadows. Like some rake sunk to slobbering, gumming the brutalized tit of a superannuated whore, we grasp in passing a clandestine pleasure to squeeze hard, as on an overripe orange. Huddled, teeming like gutworms by the million, a clutch of demons make whoopee in our brain, and when we breathe, death floods our lungs, an invisible torrent muffled in groans. Rape, poison, the knife, fire, if these have not yet embroidered with absurd design the banal story of our sorry destiny, it's merely that our soul is, alas, not bold enough. But among jackals, panthers, bitch hounds, apes, scorpions, vultures, serpents, monsters yapping, howling, grumbling, crawling, in the foul menagerie of our vices, there is one still uglier, meaner, filthier, who without grand gesture, without a yawp, would gladly shiver the earth, swallow up the world in a yawn. Who? Ennui. Eye brimming with involuntary tears, dreaming of gallows while puffing on his hookah. You know him, reader, this dainty monster. Hypocrite reader, my fellow, my brother.
Au lecteur, la sottise, l'erreur, le péché, la lésine occupent nos esprits et travaillent nos corps, et nous alimentons nos aimables remords comme les mendiants nourrissent leur vermine. Nos péchés sont têtus, nos repentirs sont lâches, et nous faisons payer grassement nos aveux, et nous rentrons gaiement dans le chemin bourbeux, croyant par de viles pleurs laver toutes nos tâches. Sur l'oreiller du mal, c'est Satan trismégiste qui berce longuement notre esprit enchanté, et le riche métal de notre volonté est tout vaporisé par ce savant chimiste. C'est le diable qui tient les fils qui nous remuent. Aux objets répugnants, nous trouvons des appâts. Chaque jour, vers l'enfer, nous descendons d'un pas, sans horreur, à travers des ténèbres qui puent. Ainsi qu'un débauché pauvre et qui baise et mange le sein martyrisé d'une antique catin, nous volons au passage un plaisir clandestin que nous pressons bien fort comme une vieille orange. Serré, fourmillant, comme 1 million d'helminthes, dans nos cerveaux ribote un peuple de démons, et, quand nous respirons, la mort dans nos poumons descend, fleuve invisible avec de sourdes plaintes. Si le vol, le poison, le poignard, l'incendie n'ont pas encore brodé de leurs plaisants dessins le canevas banal de nos piteux destins, c'est que notre âme, hélas, n'est pas assez hardie. Mais parmi les chacals, les panthères, les lys, les singes, les scorpions, les vautours, les serpents, les monstres glapissants, hurlants, grognants, rampants, dans la ménagerie infâme de nos vices, il en est un plus laid, plus méchant, plus immonde. Quoiqu'il ne pousse ni grand geste, ni grand cri, il ferait volontiers de la terre un débris et dans un bâillement avalerait le monde. C'est l'ennui, l'œil chargé d'un pleur involontaire. Il rêve d'échafaud en fumant son hookah. Tu le connais, lecteur, ce monstre délicat? Hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère.
Thank you. Thank you.